All right, well, we might make a start. I'm conscious that many people on this call will be taking time out from their day during their lunch hour. We really are delighted to have Rick Doblin with us. Rick Doblin was one of the main inspirations, I have to say, behind setting up Mind Medicine Australia, and he's been enormously supportive since day one. He's a teacher on our faculty for the certificate course in psychedelic therapies, and each year he takes time out of his schedule to provide more generalized webinars. So Rick, thank you again for giving us your time, and it's a very exciting time to be hearing from you in terms of what's happening with MDMA.
Yeah.
Just a few words from me to contextualize this discussion. When Tanya and I got involved with setting up Mind Medicine Australia 4.5 years ago, I'm not sure that we really understood what we were taking on, because it's been a pretty challenging time since then. But I want to give you a bit of context before Rick speaks, and I'll go through it very quickly. But just a couple of words at the start. This is all about medical use of psychedelic therapies, or Mind Medicine is. This session is being recorded, so it's available on our platform. And again, if there's anyone on the webinar who wants to talk about illegal use of these substances, please don't do it on our platforms, because we want the regulator to really be focused on medical use. Having said that, we have a lot of sympathy for getting these drug laws better and more sensible. Look, when we came in 4.5 years ago, one of the benefits of coming in from the outside is that it perhaps enables you to see things more clearly without vested interests. And what we saw was really a mental health sector in a bit of turmoil, because the numbers kept getting worse. You know, this 1 in 5 Australians pre-COVID, this increasing use of antidepressants, without seeing the benefit of that flow through to whole of system numbers. The fact that antidepressants are now being used more actively with young people, 1 in 4 older people now on them, 1 in 7 Australians, so it's pervasive across our society, and the dependency, side effects and withdrawal symptoms that they can give. Now, I'm not in any way, by the way, downgrading the importance of SSRIs. I'm just concerned that they're being used perhaps too much. Massive costs of all of this to our society, and I'm not just talking about the suffering, I'm talking about the loss of human potential, the enormous costs to society because of that, let alone the dollars involved in supporting the mental health sector. And at the same time, what we were seeing was a governments and peak bodies being largely process-driven and incremental in their thinking, peak bodies struggling with change, and lots of wonderful people in the sector doing amazing work, but also constrained because of others in the sector who've got vested interests against change. The elephant in the room to us, or one of the main elephants in the room, was lack of treatment effectiveness for many people. And that was combined with a lack of innovation and a lack of urgency for change amongst the people who had whole of system responsibilities. And when I talk about change, I'm not talking about incremental change. I'm talking about paradigm shift so that we can get more people well. And most of you on the call will know these numbers, but there are a large number of people with depression who are treatment resistant. They get no benefit from the current system, or very little benefit. There's even a larger proportion of people with PTSD who don't go into remission. And in both cases, as I say, a large treatment resistant component. High relapse rates with both of those illnesses, but also with drug addiction, anorexia being a terrible illness, very hard to treat. Many wonderful frontline clinicians, but unfortunately, our wonderful clinicians lack, in our view, the tools that they need to be able to use the right tool with the right patient to get the best result. So the underlying theme that I just want to stress is that we can kid ourselves and incremental change will get us there. But in our view, a more of the same incremental approach won't solve the problem. And in fact, with the acceleration of life, it'll get worse. My Medicine Australia is very much a charity. We're not out to make money. We're out to actually help people that are suffering, and do that by broadening the treatment paradigm so that our clinicians have more tools to deal with. That challenges some people who are comfortable with the status quo or only want incremental change. But our view has been, well, we'll talk to them as best we can, but we're not going to be constrained in terms of driving for change by people who are frankly too comfortable with the status quo. Primary focus on psychedelic therapies, just because there's an innovation, they are ahead of anything else in terms of the trial results we're seeing. Psilocybin, MDMA, and we're now starting to focus much more on ketamine because of some really impressive overseas trial results. At all stages, we're talking about use in the mental health system in a really controlled manner. The ambition of my medicine is that these therapies become an integral part of the mental health system. They achieve high remission rates. That leads to a substantial improvement in the mental health statistics, and they become accessible and affordable to all Australians who need them. So I don't think we can be criticised for lack of ambition. In terms of the strategy of My Medicine Australia, it's been consistent. 4 components. The first one is building awareness, and we do that in many forms. And one of them is this platform that we have of webinars from leading experts from around the world. We're constantly presenting to different groups, including regulators, politicians, clinicians, and so forth, and the media. The second thing is our certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies. That was designed to train clinicians so that they were ready for these therapies when they could become legally accessible. And we do that, as you'll see, through a world-class faculty. The third area is interface with the university sector because of the important role that universities play. My Medicine Australia because of My Medicine Australia and the representations we made in Canberra, we saw a $15 million grant round come from the Commonwealth Government for psychedelic therapies. At the time, and I think it still is, that's the largest government grant ever globally. So it's another first for Australia. We were behind the establishment of the Neuromedicines Discovery Centre at Monash University. We took the idea to Monash, and that's all about developing the molecules. We're funding 2 trials at the moment. One is a healthy persons trial. The second one is second one, which we're part funding, is an OCD trial. University sector is obviously important for economic analysis and teaching of the various health sector disciplines. And the last area is regulatory access gateways, making sure we get the right clinicians to advise us on developing the right protocols, having the right rollout strategy, making sure these therapies are cost effective. And by the way, let me just say that we hear in the media talk of these therapies costing between $25,000 and $30,000. That is absolute nonsense. And it's going to be significantly way below that, actually. We've now got secure medicine supplies at very favourable pricing. We're focused on a patient support fund. So it's really all the things necessary to make these therapies part of our mental health system, but in a really structured and controlled fashion with great expertise. A few months ago, Australia, or the TGA, announced the rescheduling of these medicines. That makes Australia the first country in the world to do that. It means we have the spotlight from other parts of the globe. A lot of interest in what Australia is doing. A lot of surprise, frankly, that Australia is taking the lead, but I think we can all be very pleased with that. But it does put a heavy obligation on us to make sure that we get the controls and the approach right. And we're very, very alive to that. In terms of our certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies, you should just take a look at the faculty. It's world-class. It's drawing upon expertise from around the world to make sure that the students in that course really do get the very best teaching. And through that teaching, they're able to develop their own skills in a way which makes them really good in terms of dealing with patients and maximising the success rate of these therapies. We combine weekly webinars with experts, with a 6-day residential, which is much more hands-on. which Ben Sess is coming out this year to lead, which again is very exciting. As I say, it's a comprehensive course. It covers MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine. It was the first course of its type in Australia, and it's by far the most comprehensive. Go onto the website, look at the testimonials. They really are extraordinary. But it's a clinician's course, so it's only open to people with expertise in the mental health sphere. You'd have seen this before, but David Nutt came out publicly and said that in his view, this course is the best of its kind in the world, and he's been solidly behind it. So for the clinicians on this call, firstly, there's another webinar tomorrow, which is just a clinicians webinar where we'll go into these therapies in a lot more detail. That's led by Ben Sesser and Dr. Eddie Kotler. But with the CPAC course, if you're interested, get in contact with us, because applications will close on May 31st, if not before. The first intake's already full. The second intake is filling up. So if you're interested in this, get in touch quickly, and we can explain the course to you in more detail. In terms of events going forward, we have monthly webinars normally, and you'll see that 2 of the next 4 webinars are focused on ketamine through Dr. Wolfson and Dr. Robertson. That's because ketamine is getting some really good results in overseas trials when it's combined with therapy. And then we've got Dr. Siegel talking about transpersonal awareness in everyday life, which is going to be critical, I think, to making sure that remission rates are sustainable. And the legendary James Fadiman talking about microdosing. Last slide, how can you help us? Well, the first thing is to stay informed. Get on top of the research, all of the data, follow us on social media. Our website contains a massive amount of information. Get on top of it so that you can really hold yourself in discussions with other people that purport to have expertise, many of whom frankly don't, but are prepared to express views and rely upon their credibility to hear for those views to be accepted. Often they're not based upon doing the hard yards in terms of understanding the research. Build momentum with us by using that awareness through discussions with your colleagues, friends, clinicians, researchers, politicians, regulators, and media. Maintaining this momentum is going to be incredibly important over the next few years. We are a charity. We're not out to make money. We're driven by compassion, but donations are a critical component of funding Mind Medicine Australia. So if you're so inclined, please be generous, get behind us and support us, and also volunteer, particularly clinicians. The workload is extraordinary at Mind Medicine Australia, so having skilled clinicians working with us is really important. Last point I want to make before handing across to Rick is that really important that we create some urgency in this sector. There are too many people, as we all know, suffering. We saw this morning the Melbourne coroner come out with an announcement that in the first quarter of this year, 13 young people have committed suicide, another 3 in April. That means we've had more young people in, this is just Victoria, I should add, we've had more young people in Victoria commit suicide in the first 4 months than for the whole of last year. Healthy young people depend in large part on healthy adults, healthy parents. So dealing with this mental illness epidemic in Australia is really important, not just to the suffering people, but to the children of those suffering people. So with those comments, what I'd like to do now is hand across to Rick Doblin. Rick, Rick is a legend in this space. I hope I'm not embarrassing him by that comment. He's shown extraordinary tenacity over, frankly, decades to get MDMA used again as a therapy. He really is a lesson to all of us that if you want to get something done, just put your head down and keep going. and where you see obstacles, just ride through the obstacles. So, Rick, this is an incredibly important time for MAPS. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And I'm really glad to be here with all of you as well. And there was one major accomplishment of Mind Medicine Australia, Peter, that I might have missed you saying it, or maybe you didn't emphasize it, but I think it's a phenomenal step forward. And it's a protocol to have therapists receive MDMA and also psilocybin as part of their training. And that legal context is so transformative. It's such a big step forward.
Yeah, I mean, for everyone on the call, we're funding a team out of the ANU, and what it is the Healthy Persons Trial. It enables clinicians who've graduated from psychedelic-assisted therapy courses to have the opportunity to actually, as Rick says, take these medicines in a clinical environment so they experience exactly what the patient's going to go through. And one of the learnings we're looking for out of that is feedback from the clinicians involved about what works well, what didn't work so well, what is their view of these therapies now, having actually experienced the medicines in a clinical environment.
Yeah, I think it's such a key step for the training of therapists. And in particular, having both MDMA and psilocybin to distinguish them, to understand what the different ways that they impact emotions and consciousness. So I think if Australia wasn't so far away, we would be sending a lot of people to be in that protocol. We are trying to set it up like that in Canada and in the Bahamas, though. So and also in the US, but that's more complicated. Although we do have FDA permission. So the other thing I wanted to say is just that I spent a bunch of time with Ben Sessa. So I think your 6-day in-person experience is really good. I wasn't aware that Ben was doing that with you until I saw him. And you know, the work that he's done on the MDMA alcohol use disorder study and the methods that he's used are very similar to the methods that we use, that he's really understands how to work with MDMA, and he's got direct experience with patients. And so what we talked about was him creating videotapes of some of his therapy sessions. So I just want to say, I think that's a really good opportunity to spend this time with Ben Sessa, and that having him there, and we'll try to collaborate as much as we can.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, Rick, for the people on the call, we've got a clinicians only call tomorrow, webinar, led by Ben Sessa and Australian psychiatrist Ellie Kotler, getting into these things very much from the clinical perspective.
Yeah, and actually the first week in of August, we're going to have a training team working through Monash University to do a 6-day intensive therapy as well. So I think Australia is really moving forward to be a world leader, as you're saying, and to be trying to demonstrate that. I guess my one question before I start, Peter, if you could educate me a bit, is this idea of insurance coverage. Will these treatments for you have a healthy person study, you have to pay for it, but if it's all these compassionate access in a way to MDMA and psilocybin, will those be covered by national health insurance?
Yeah, what we're hearing from the psychiatrists that we're working with is that their current policies do cover it. But now it may well be that will change over time, and the premiums will go up to cover. But at the moment, from a psychiatrist perspective, they do cover it.
Wow. And then from a therapist, is that work is similar?
Well, that's where we need feedback from individual therapists in terms of what policies they're on. But so far, we've had no resistance there.
Wow, that's fantastic.
And by the way, because these therapies will inevitably be done under the watchful eye of the psychiatrist. The team will be under the psychiatrist. So again, the feedback we've had from the psychiatrists we've been dealing with is that should also enable the people involved to be covered.
That's interesting, because we think that the person that has the prescription is a doctor, doesn't need to be a psychiatrist necessarily. They need to do the medical screenings. And we really rely more on the people that have been through the training program that are licensed to do therapy. And so there is that medical supervision, but not necessarily a psychiatrist. But if psychiatrists wanted to do that, that would be good. But it's broader, and it'll end up being a much shorter training for the prescribers because there's much less involved than just physically what the screening is.
By the way, Rick, I don't think you will find that many psychiatrists will want to be in the room. They may want to be in the room once, but I can't imagine, given the demands on them, that they're going to be regular therapists in this, or very few of them will be. But they will be overseeing the whole thing in terms of the team and the patient review and so forth, or the patient screening and weaning patients off medications where that's an integral part of the work pre-therapy or pre-dosing.
Yeah, I'd be reluctant to give the psychiatrist that much power and authority, that they're the only ones that could hire, qualified therapists or other doctors to run a clinic or run a practice. But I can see how it sounds good.
We need you in Australia, Rick, to persuade our TGA that it needs to be expanded.
Well, if we can get that through the FDA, that should help them, He agrees with it. And they do already. Well, we'll see for the final. I mean, for where we're at now, it's one thing. But post-approval or through the approval process, it will change, maybe. Okay, great. So we're at an incredible time, and you're making great progress. And I think what I'd like to do is just give you a sense of where MAPS is at, and I'll just share my screen. And then we'll definitely have time for questions. So we are now at a place with 2 successful phase 3 studies in MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. It's taken us 37 years of psychedelic science. Our 37th anniversary was in April. This is the MAPS logo, which is by the artist Alex Gray, and it's to emphasize that it's about people helping people. The psychedelic is the background, the therapy is the foreground, and that this is really primarily humans helping humans. Again, we want to keep that as the special understanding, people reaching out and helping each other. And so it's a beautiful slide here of MDMA crystal, seen under a microscope. It's a very stable molecule invented by Merck in 1912. It's one of the most stable molecules. We actually have, I had MDMA made in 1985 by Dr. Dave Nichols for use in animal studies and later in human research. And that's now 38 years old, and we still have it, and it's still in really great shape. It's a very stable molecule. It releases serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, releases hormones. We think mostly of the oxytocin, but other hormones as well. It's a complex cascade of things. And it has this almost perfectly tailored for treating PTSD. So PTSD, you have hyperactivity in the amygdala, constantly on edge. Fear is very close to the surface. Prefrontal cortex activity is diminished, and you're not thinking as logically, you're more reactive. And then this decreased activity in the hippocampus, where you're putting memories into long-term storage. So it's like you have this fear-based memory you can't really be rational about as much as you could before, and it's never really put into the past. And that's what happens in a way in the brain with PTSD. But when you give MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala. It reduces this fear response to painful emotions. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, so you can process it, and it increases activity and connectivity with the amygdala to the hippocampus, so that you can store these memories. And there's neuroplasticity going on at the same time. This is Johns Hopkins researcher Gould Dolan, and this was a study in octopuses. And if you've seen my octopus teacher, they are solitary creatures, and unless it's mating season, and they diverged from humans around 600 or so million years ago, the humans and octopus line, but they still process serotonin. And so it turns out you give octopuses MDMA and they become more pro-social. So there's something about that. And then she also showed that in mice that it releases, MDMA releases oxytocin, and that opens up this critical learning critical period, social reward learning critical period, but it's other kind of critical periods of neuroplasticity. And that so the actual rerouting of different pathways in your brain for processing memories and emotions in certain ways, it's rewiring your brain as a result of this mediated through the oxytocin dependence. And so there's just a great opportunity to understand how it is that there can be longer term effects, because you are actually making a change in the route of processing in your brain. And then you have to support it. And we've met with the European Medicines Agency, and they have agreed that they will take our US data and they want to see one pivotal phase 3 study. And there's this sense that we will have the US data. Since then, the Brexit has happened, and now they're in Amsterdam, the European Medicines Agency, and we are now negotiating with the MHRA, or thinking about the British health authorities. We're in discussions with them. And if you have FDA EMA approval, you can pretty much get approval all over the world, and there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 million or more people with PTSD. We are in multiple countries and locations throughout Europe in early studies to train therapists, open label studies, to try to supervise therapists as they're working with their first PTSD patient by our adherence raters, giving them feedback. And that's what we've had underway in some of these sites. There's this key aspect of the therapy. It's this alliance between the therapist and the participants. This is what's been shown to be the most important factor, regardless of the kind of therapy, this therapeutic alliance, and that this demonstration of that we're supporting the participant's own healing experience. We're encasing it in process of preparation and intention and integration, and this trust and what's emerging. This sort of direction of the session sorts from their experience. This is what would be experienced by a patient, is that there's this flow of thoughts and images, and we support that rather than put a framework on top of it. So it's sourced from the participant. Inner-directed therapy, inner-directed therapeutic approach, this intrinsic natural ability to heal. This is our treatment manual. It's in its 8th edition, and it's based in large part on what we learned from Stan Grof from the early work with LSD research, and this sense of, again, the realms of the human unconscious was Stan's first book. And it's just that emergence and letting that all emerge. So this is something we've been studying for a very long time, and it's based on pioneering work before. We have adherence raters that evaluate videotapes and give numericals and other kinds of feedback to therapists and to supervisors as part of the final part of the training, where you're interacting with people who have worked with PTSD patients before, and they're sort of our core trainers who know the inner-directed therapy approach. And we're looking at verbal communication, the rapport that's established, communicating safety, support, these things, empathic presence, inner-directed approach. That there is this adherence rating document up on our website, as is the treatment manual. And then there is this initial part that is this culmination online and also in person. And so I think that's what I was saying that Ben Sess is going to do there, what we're going to do there. Bruce and Marcella, our trainers, are coming. then there's the in-person point. Then this protocol that's kind of a breakthrough in Australia to receive MDMA and psilocybin, that should always be optional, that should be strongly encouraged, but always optional. And that's a tremendous opportunity for people if they want to take it. And then this consultation, as I was saying, with the adherence criteria is the final thing. And then there can be continued supervision, and then over time we can introduce new materials from what we've learned. It could be like continuing medical education or therapeutic education. And so we do have this upcoming training in Monash. So our phase 3 results, and this is what makes us think, based on a prior negotiation with FDA called a special protocol assessment, where they agreed on our protocol designs and the package of information that they want to see to approve it, that this is the database that we think will persuade the FDA to determine, which is their decision to determine whether this has been proven safe and effective for PTSD. This was Nature Medicine, our first phase 3 study, published May 2021. And it was tremendously successful. It was in severe PTSD patients. And it was a comparison of therapy with inactive placebo. It is placebo-controlled, but it's an inactive placebo with therapy with MDMA. New York Times said it was, well, of course, we're doing, we plan this ahead of time, meaning that we are engaged in public education as well. And there's a lot of public interest in this. It's basically this, I'm sorry for the top part of the slide, but our treatment intervention is 3 MDMA sessions, 8 hours each, 3 to 5 weeks apart, basically a month apart, and then 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 for preparation and 3 for integration after each MDMA. So it's a total of 42 hours of therapy, and we have 2 therapists. There's the first therapist in our negotiations with FDA currently needs to be licensed to do therapy. The second person doesn't need to be licensed. They need a bachelor's degree, which I think is excessive, and they need like 1,000 hours of behavioral health experience, which I think is good, but shouldn't be required. It should be for interns if they want to be, and then we keep the 2-person team, which I think is better at a lower, and it's a way to bring in new people. But that's our kind of treatment model. So people get randomized into 3 MDMA sessions. The first is a lower kind of moderate dose, we would say 80 milligrams, followed 2 hours later by 40. There's a little bit of discretion, 1.5 to 2.5 hours, if you want to make it a tiny bit more intense, but basically it just extends the plateau. And then the second session and the third session are choices, but over 90% of the people elect to go to the 120 milligram dose, followed by 60 milligrams a little bit later. Again, between 1.5 to 2 hours later. And again, about 90% go on to stay at that dose for the third session. And then it's 2 months follow-up. And that's this isn't the psychedelic after trying to see if it's durable. The people are mostly women, 2/3 women, but a lot of 1/3 men, and a lot of the men were involved in some sort of, but not always, and other kinds of violence or traumas. These are people that were chronic PTSD, average of over 14 years, 1/3 over 20 years. These are people stuck with PTSD. These are people also at somewhat serious risk of suicide. 1/3 of them, more or less, if you look on the far right side, positive behavior, have actually either tried to kill themselves before or contemplated it to the point of about doing something, but then like going to a bridge but not jumping off or something. Serious ideation, tormenting thoughts about this was, again, way more than 1/3, around 40%. But then positive thoughts of it, not good thoughts, but I mean, thinking about suicide, over 90% have done so. This is the results. The top line is the therapy with inactive placebo. The bottom line is therapy with MDMA. Most people can tell whether they have MDMA or inactive placebo, say over 90%. One thing just about this chart is the dots are after each MDMA session, and you can see the distance between the dots grows after each MDMA session. So there's this cumulative effect of the deepening of this process that's begun under MDMA. There's a similar deepening of the process, as you can see, that is done under the therapy. And people do really pretty well on this therapy, not all of them, but this is the average. And this MDMA, though, accelerates the process every time, even more than the time before. That's what this is showing. Now, there's statistical issues. Is that really certain? No, but that's just what it shows. But as far as the statistics of it, 0.0001 up on the right hand, that's 1 in 10,000 chance that this difference between the two groups is due to something other than the MDMA. So we're very, very certain that this is the MDMA. Similar differences with depression, with functional impairment. As I said, people do really well in the therapy only, in a sense. 1/3, 32%, no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. But when you add the MDMA, it's 2/3, more than 2/3. And we found a durable response from the preliminary findings in this long-term follow-up for the first phase 3 study. In phase 2, just to point out, it was lower, 23%. In the control group, but that was when the control group was mixing low-dose MDMA, which we add with inactive placebo in the placebo groups in different of the studies. And so it demonstrates that, as we thought, that there's kind of a mitigating effect on therapy of low doses. It makes people sometimes uncomfortable. It activates them, but the fear reduction, amygdala reduction is not enough. But it's still a quarter of them almost no longer have PTSD, compared to over half, 54% with MDMA. But the result here to show is that at the 1-year follow-up, the results even improved. So people are getting better on their own without the drug. That's the main point. And so this is really the astounding findings. The observational studies, which I just mentioned, were at least 6 months, some cases a year or more since their session, and a durable response. And so we're working to publish this study. Works on the hardest cases. This is the dissociative subtype on the left. And they were worse to start out with than everybody. And they improved as much as everybody else. And it's such more statistically significant just because they started out so worse and ended up pretty much in the same place. So it helps people who are distant. Dissociation, common strategy when you're traumatized, but it's a very promising finding that it works in the most difficult cases. This is a study comparing effect sizes, and that's what effect sizes are designed to do, to compare studies across effects of studies across different treatment interventions. And these are the same kind of patients. All of them are PTSD patients. And you can see that Paxil had 1 study in phase 3, it failed. It had 2 other that succeeded, with a small to a medium effect size. An effect size of 1 is 1 standard deviation from the norm. And the effect size, our placebo subtracted 0.91, that was subtracting therapy, which was effective. So that's just MDMA. But our other effect size over 2 standard deviations from the norm combined with MDMA for therapy. We have not done any head-to-head clinical trials against these, but these are the effect sizes, and that's what effect sizes are for. CAPS, the sites, we had 15 different sites, 2 in Israel, 2 in Canada, 11 in the US, and the outcomes were evenly distributed. So what it meant is it's not the most experienced therapists who are driving the outcomes. That's what they want to see. This means it's scalable. This means that we can train people. It's due in part, we think, to the quality of our MDMA therapy training program. And I'm sure the quality of the program that you're in, combined with these in-person programs, and then also with somebody like Ben Sessa, and also the opportunity to take MDMA. And then the final supervision part, I think, is important to have as well. And also, I think it's because of therapeutic potential of MDMA. So this means no side effects. Really, this means it's scalable if we just train enough therapists. That's an interesting study from comparing, again, two different studies not conducted at the same time in a head-to-head, but both PTSD patients. And this was done by the Veterans Administration, 900 veterans with PTSD. So if you can look on the green and yellow lines, they start a little bit lower on the degree to which they have PTSD symptoms. Their scores are lower than the people, ours is the blue and the red. And we end up doing the best, meaning we MDMA-assisted therapy. But the most important point here is that the dropout rates in the upper right-hand corner, that our dropout rate was 6.5%. Hardly anybody drops out. And then there's prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, over 50, almost 50 or over 50% dropped out of the study. It was too difficult. It was traumatizing. So the results you're seeing are the people that are left in the study. The hardest cases are even out of it. And so again, we work with the hardest cases. So this is a suggestion that there's a way to improve how the Veterans Administration treats PTSD. And so we have a bunch of studies in the VA I'll talk about in a second. There is safety data, muscle tightness, decrease. All these things are more in MDMA than in the placebo, but they're temporary and they're minor, non-serious, transient, treatment emergent. We did have 2 people try to commit suicide, both in the placebo group. One woman self-hospitalized with severe suicidal ideation. She didn't try it, but the other woman did try suicide twice, which shows that background is difficult for severe PTSD. Also, we do require people to taper off their SSRIs to be in this. And then on these other suicidality, cardiovascular abuse potential, there was no differences really between the groups. Science considered it one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the year, our study, which was really gratifying. And our new study, prior positive results were confirmed in our philanthropy-funded phase 3 trial. January 5th is when we put out this press release. It was very statistically significant. The safety was great, and we're working on a scientific paper. And so this is the package then that we think we're going to submit. This is just to show you all the aspects of going to the FDA and what you need to do. And we think by around June, we hope, of 2024, hopefully we would have FDA approval. If so, there's different places to have different strategies on the label or in the risk evaluation mitigation strategies documents. But what makes sense is to say that only trained therapists are the ones that can actually work with patients, and that they have to be through a training program, such as what's being developed. And this would be evaluated by the national healthcare, by the insurance companies. And what we would like is for us to make it into a medicine that the trainings that use MDMA for PTSD are authorized by us, which means that there's core competencies that they teach. And that's okay. And we want this to be spread out all over the place in universities and schools, by other programs. We want the core competencies to be widely distributed by whoever. And I think Ben Sessa, can do a good job on teaching these core competencies. And then that there's only the prescribers have been through certain training too, that they have to learn a little bit about the medical complications, and they don't necessarily have to learn to do the therapy, certain kind of safety screening. And we're trying to figure out distribution models to supply MDMA to the prescribers or the patients, probably that way rather than like pick it up at a pharmacy, but not sure. And then we did have this dispute with FDA about where they wanted to not give us permission for a study to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And they wanted the lead person MD PhD, and they wanted a doctor on site. And we objected, took us $250,000 of lawyers, and we wiped it out. And so we do have this protocol. It's been approved about 1.5 years ago. We've not implemented it yet. The lead facilitator doesn't need to be MD PhD, and the physician doesn't need to be on call. So this is the senior leadership of FDA overruled the division. So this demonstrates that there is a way to negotiate. We do want to do pediatric studies. We are being required to do that if we succeed in adults. And that's really, I think, very important. And then we want to do a dose response safety study with people with PTSD on SSRIs, because they do dampen the effect, but it seems that you can double the effect and or double the amount of MDMA in some patients and receive more of a full MDMA experience. But the concern is serotonin syndrome, but it doesn't seem to happen. There's a lot of evidence to suggest it doesn't happen, but we would need the safety study, and that would change the dynamics for MDMA if people didn't need to withdraw from their SSRIs, although we would still encourage them to do so. And we hope to train 25,000 therapists by 2030 and treat over 1.5 million people by 2032. If we can, there's of the 13 million. So that would be, 10% over the next 8 years. It just shows you the enormity of the problem. So we have our therapeutic method, but we don't think that it's the only method or the only modality that it can be used in. It's being combined with MDMA-assisted cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy with Candace Monson, was the first to pioneer it. She helped develop it. This is, again, where you're moving the unit of therapy to the couple or the dyad. Ann Wagner, who works with Candace, is now blending MDMA with cognitive processing therapy, and also is doing a larger study on MDMA for with Ann on cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy and MDMA. And these are accepted inside the VA. Also, prolonged exposure as a evidence-based therapy accepted in the VA, and we're working with different people, Barbara Rothbaum at Emory and Edna Foa in Israel, who developed prolonged exposure to blend it with MDMA to see how that works and see how they combine when they might use some of these techniques. We've done studies with MDMA for social anxiety in adults on the autism spectrum and had really good reductions in social anxiety. Similarly, with anxiety related to life-threatening illnesses, been terrific. This alcohol use disorder study. And then within the VA, and this is part of the really the mainstreaming, Loma Linda VA, October 12th, 2021 is when we, with Shannon Remick and Ali Cagle, 26 years after we first, it took us 26 years to get into the VA, and this was with our therapeutic approach. Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA is doing incredible work, 2 MDMA sessions versus 3, and training lots of therapists. We're starting this group therapy study with 4 therapists for 6 veterans with PTSD. Each one will get an MDMA experience individually first before the group. We're doing a study or investigator-initiated trial sometimes, MDMA-assisted therapy compared to cognitive processing therapy. So this is going to be the first comparative study, and this will be really interesting to see how that works. This is also a comparative study with an active comparator of low-dose amphetamine. So MDMA-assisted therapy versus therapy with low-dose amphetamine. And low-dose amphetamine will give people, I think it'll probably help them. I'm not sure what they're really trying to prove. I guess they're trying to prove, can you do the same thing with D-amphetamine instead of MDMA, which would be interesting. And then this is, again, San Diego VA and Phoenix VA, trying to bring it inside the VA. In the San Diego study, it'll be the short version of cognitive behavior conjoint therapy, and one person, the vet, will get the MDMA, but not the other. And in the Phoenix VA study, it will be the long version of cognitive behavior conjoint therapy, and both will get the MDMA. And we just started making these numbers up, but we think there'll be thousands of clinics, and this is going to develop because there's already over 1,500 ketamine clinics in America, well over. So the clinics, just to say, will be, and the therapists, even if it's a private practice at home, will be cross-trained in psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, and that's why it's great that the training you're going through is doing that. We hope that by 2035, we'll be at a place where drug policy itself will have evolved so that there'll be legal access for adults outside of medicine, outside of religion, and also for their own children if they want, that will be with parental permission. So I think that this will be around 2035, after we have a decade of these psychedelic clinics. And you get a little license like this, like a credit card, and it is approved for a bunch of different drugs or just one drug at a time. Ideally, in the future, I think that these clinics become right of initiation. So if you want to get a license, you got an experience under supervision, paid for by the taxes, you know what it is, and then you get a license to do it. And we want to build a world of net zero trauma by 2070. That's the new manual medicine that looks on track. So this is thinking several generations ahead. And to do that, we need to make a measure of gross national trauma, like this Global Peace Index, the gross national happiness for Bhutan. And this will be the metric over decades. To do this, we want to work with people who are incarcerated, refugees and migrants, and prioritize global communities with the largest burden of trauma and fewest resources, and develop culturally appropriate support, likely in group settings, led by local healers and train the trainers model. Over 100 million forcibly displaced people. And if climate change goes in some predictions, there could be over 1 billion climate refugees in the next quarter century. And we are working with people in various places to do different kind of humanitarian projects. We're really sort of trying to envision what those might be and what it'll do to take to get permission. There is this other line of research, ayahuasca and MDMA used for conflict resolution. There are Israelis and Palestinians doing MDMA and ayahuasca together. And Lior Roseman from Imperial College has been studying this. He recently brought together Palestinians and Israelis in Spain in person for a week-long, I think it was a 10-day retreat, actually. And we're working with Hebrew University to develop metrics to do something with that with MDMA. And we are having the world's largest psychedelic conference. I know it's a long way from Australia, but you're all welcome to it. Come, invited, June 19th to 23rd. We've already got about 6,000 or more people coming. And it's going to be a way to really learn. We have the Denver Convention Center, so there's going to be a lot of exhibits, and it's really where we're at. And again, doing this upcoming training. And the reason I'm saying that is just because it's so important what is being done in Australia. You are going to be an example. There's a similar, I would say not that similar, but Iceland is another island, and there's 380,000 people in Iceland. We're doing a training there, and we're thinking in November probably. So Iceland could become a government that fully integrates psychedelics throughout their healthcare and their prison system. And I'm saying, you're thinking you can be way ahead in Australia and be an example for the world. So I think it's terrific that you want to become therapists, and Peter and Tanya, it's terrific that you're really trying to build this therapy program to help them do that.
I'm muted. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rick, thank you. Thank you very much for an extraordinary presentation. What I love about the work you do is the ambition. So many of us are constrained in the way we think. People so often think incrementally. They debate subjects ad nauseum. They go around in circles. But what you do is you sort of look at trauma and say, actually, why can't we get rid of this stuff? Yeah.
Well, the one thing I should have put in there, maybe in the future, is just this idea of multi-generational trauma. And and Rachel Yehuda has found epigenetic markers of multi-generational trauma. So we need to be thinking about it as inherited trauma and then experienced trauma, and trying to, and actually one of the studies that's being done by Rachel at the Bronx VA is doing epigenetic measures before and after MDMA-assisted therapy to see if these
Fantastic.
for epigenetic transmission can go down.
All right, well, look, lots of questions, so I'll go through them quite quickly, but just some points of clarification for everybody coming out of the chat. I mean, the first thing somebody said, where did this rescheduling come from? It seemed to come out of the blue. It was 4 years in the making for Mind Medicine Australia. You know, we put an enormous amount of effort into it. If you go and look at our applications, they are full of data from the trials. They're full of expert input. It didn't happen overnight. It was an exhausting process, but to the credit of the TGA, they listened to the arguments, and they came to the view that actually the cost of doing nothing was that really outweighed the issues associated with rescheduling, and that we have to start offering people who are treatment resistant a therapy that could work for them at the choice of them and their medical advisor. So that's the first point. The second point is with our course, a couple of things. I mean, firstly, there is an ability for us to provide financial assistance. So there was one comment on the chat that love to be part of that course, but I can't afford it. If you can't genuinely afford to do the course, there is a process at Mind Medicine to subsidize you. What we want are the best practitioners coming into the course, and we want a diversified group of practitioners. The third point I just wanted to clarify is, you know, why is it, and this is the question, why is it the psychiatrists are the ones prescribing? And why has the rescheduling been structured?
Good question.
Why has the rescheduling been structured on that basis? Well, I got to say, like, I'm a pragmatist, and we wanted rescheduling to happen. And yes, in another world, in an ideal world, we would have had a broader group of people that could have prescribed these therapies. But we took the view that at this stage of Australia's emergence, that would be a bridge too far. It was better to get the psychiatrists prescribing, and as people got more comfortable, then broadening the prescribing group, doing it that way and rescheduling rather than trying to get the nirvana end result.
Yeah, well, you went the more established approach. So you had this idea, the psychiatrists are the experts. We went the other way around and said it's about the therapists. And the psychiatrists these days often know nothing about therapy. And they're, as you say, they're so busy, you know, giving appointments for 15 minutes to prescribe medications. So we said it's really about the therapeutic. That's why the image of the hands before everything, and that doesn't mean necessarily psychiatrists. It means medical screening and quality sitting therapy. No,
I get that. I get that, Rick. And but I guess not guess. We just took the view that had we gone in with that sort of route, we would still be debating for the next few years.
Yeah, that could be very. You certainly pragmatism where it's harder for them to say no.
The other sort of one other issue that was raised on the chat is, well, why are we limiting our course to clinicians or people with mental health expertise? And the reason is this, and Rick's talked about it. You know, we have to scale in Australia, and in order to scale, we have to do it with, if you like, the most experienced people. And you know, we're dealing with people who are treatment resistant, they're vulnerable, and we want the best expertise in the room with them. So, you know, maybe over time we can broaden the group, but there's only a limited number of places available. So at this stage, we really do need to limit it to people with direct expertise in treating or dealing with mental health. So that was just a few clarifications. Rick, one of the fascinating things I'd love you to talk about is that MAPS is sort of going through a transformation at the moment. You know, you've spent a long time working on trial design and trials to get people, regulators, to take these therapies seriously, and you've had enormous success with that, and to prove that these therapies can work. But you're now going into, and you've touched upon it a number of times, this whole issue of scale and managing scale, and that's a different skills base. And I know you're adjusting MAPS to accommodate that, but perhaps just talk about the challenges of that,
Yeah.
the organizational challenges of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's not so much scale for me as it's the difference in functions from doing the clinical studies to developing a patient access commercialization network and ecosystem to do that. The scale, I think that there's a really need to scale the number of trainers who can train other therapists, but to do that out of a smaller pool, it's going a little bit slower because we're building that out of those people that have actually worked with MDMA with PTSD patients, or in Ben Sessa's case with alcohol use disorder, under which it seemed that people were running away from trauma. So it was basically the same as PTSD research, the work that he was doing with alcohol use disorder, so that we built it out. So I think the challenge is to keep the quality as you scale. I mean, it's easier to scale, but it's not so hard to, and so you have to resist temptation, I think, to scale too quickly. And that's why, I think there'll be a process whereby the trainings that you do will become easier to do. But we found that during COVID, we scaled with one training that had over 300 people. It was all online. Another training had over 500 people that was all online. And the trainers felt that they really didn't know that they were communicating enough. They didn't get a good feel for it, and they don't want to do that again. Yep. And so there's limits to scale. And I think this additional part that you're doing with Ben with the in-person thing is really an important component. Yep. So there are limits on scaling that way. But then the organization, in terms of, I think the hardest thing for me has been the difference in risk tolerance, I would say, between a kind of earlier scrappier startup and then a larger bureaucratic and heavily regulated commercial company. So that's that. And then the enormous amounts of money as you move through this process. So there's been an incredible scale in expenses as well. And at each level, you're telling a different story to the donors of what you're trying to accomplish, or to the investors. And we're at that. I'm really glad you helped me come to that. We're at this incredible point of, after 37 years, 145 million in grants and donations, around 43 million in royalty share. Yeah. This, and then 20 million in a convertible note. That we are sitting here with MAPS is the 100% owner of this public benefit corp, with 2 successful phase 3 studies for MDMA, which is a phenomenal global drug that has enormous market. So, but we need a bunch of money to go to FDA approval. So there's basically this fork in the road: is do we become a publicly traded company, or do we stay philanthropically funded? And so we are trying to tell the story to all the different kind of potential sources of capital, and we will be deciding in the next couple of months. So it's a tremendous moment of, I call it a perilous moment of great opportunity.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, isn't it? Because it's a moment of great opportunity, but it's also a moment where you've got to be incredibly careful that you don't lose what's MAPS successful.
I think that you're so right. And I think it's right to have kind of a natural resistance to the going public, and what that does for the priorities and the accomplishments, or you can say scale. I mean, there is that thing about going public gives access to capital for scaling, unless you happen to get it from philanthropy, which is also yeah. So my hope, of course, is that it stay in a philanthropic, that MAPS retains 100% owner of the benefit corp. I worry about the influences of having to focus on shareholder return. But if they're mission related and mission aligned shareholders, then you're in good shape too. Yeah.
One of the questions we've had, Rick, and I'd love your insights into it, is that we've limited participants in our course to clinicians, people who've got direct expertise in dealing with people who are going through a really challenging time. And there was a comment that, well, people with lived experience have experience too. Why aren't they part of the therapeutic team? How do you respond to that question? Because it's always a sensitive area in Australia.
Some of the most experienced, we have a major debt of gratitude to the underground therapists, and they are among the most skilled and talented. Now, there are some that are new to that as well, but there's, if that's what you mean, that there's these practitioners that are unlicensed, that have been courageous and have studied this, done their own work, done this for a long time. There are people that are leaders in their field, but how do we get them to work in this above ground regulated context? And there was just something, I was working on that earlier today. It's the same way as how do we get the drugs themselves up from the underground and accepted? So I do think that there's got to be a way, but it's not going to be the same way that you say to start with psychiatrists. It's not going to be the first thing. The FDA is saying a bachelor's degree and 1,000 hours of behavioral health experience to be the second person, but to be the first person, you need a license. Yeah. So there is a path to being the second person. I mean, that's going to be probably the path I'm going to try. Not to go and get a license, but partner with somebody that has a license. I think that's one approach, but it's the system. The system is what is the national health insurance going to pay for? It's like, how do you evaluate shamans? What do? You got licenses first, so it's hard. It's going to be hard, but I think a lot of them will. What we should say is that as it becomes more regulated, there'll be less and less pressure on the underground therapists. They can keep practicing.
Yeah. Because one of the other sides of this is that
probably even less expensive, because they won't have all the infrastructure.
Well, I was going to come to that, because one of the, I think, biggest challenges for the sector going forward is, as soon as you bring these therapies into a clinical environment, there's a real risk that they start to lose the magic that can make such a difference to somebody who's suffering. How do you think about that? And it's all about those processes and procedures.
I don't know what you mean, because it's already in a clinical context. So what do you mean? You're not moving it? It is in a clinical context, and so if you mean that it moves from research into the real world, I mean
it goes from the underground, who are doing it in a particular way, to a clinical environment, which is very. It can be very.
Limited. Antiseptic. So, for example, to be very specific, LSD and MDMA are great combinations for therapeutic purposes, and also MDMA and psilocybin, MDMA and 5-MeO-DMT, other combinations, but and they're practiced freely in the underground. But to do that in research settings, clinical practice can take a long time. So the underground is actually ahead of the clinical practice, and I think that from what I've heard from the opinion of Stan Groff, one of the ways to the underground is way ahead, is 5-MeO-DMT mixed with MDMA. And I think that's kind of a centering, as your kind of Stan described it as the future of psychiatry.
Right. But it sounds fascinating. We just need to get our big bodies to sort of be open as well about these issues. There's another question here, Rick. I'm conscious it's sort of midnight your time. But the question is, given the similarities between BPD and
that's a good question. I saw that in the chat. We exclude people with borderline personality disorder because we think that not that it can't help them. We think it can help them, but that they often need a few more sessions than just the 3-session model. So I think that there are people interested in trying to study that. We are trying to work with people on investigator-initiated trials, I think, on that. I think we've felt that it can be useful, but often we get the sense that there's difficulties separating from the rigid, you could say, clinical structure of the protocol. But basically just to say is that you have a whole bunch of exclusion criteria, and over time, that's to do your clinical trials, and you're being cautious, and sometimes you're being overcautious, but you don't always know. And then over time, you're expanding into these various areas that had previously been exclusionary criteria cautiously and learning from it. And I think BPD is one of the best ones. Also ketamine, there was actually somebody that had depression and borderline personality disorder, went for ketamine therapy, had the vision that in order to get himself out of his depression, he had to help other people. And he was an early Bitcoin guy, and he decided to give away $88 million worth of Bitcoins. And we got $5.25 million worth of Bitcoins.
Wow.
But he had borderline personality and depression, and ketamine was helpful for him.
So the big question, Rick, is that when you're awake at night and you're thinking about the future, and you've come a huge distance, but what are the things you worry about?
I worry about going public. I worry about going public. I worry about getting something that should be about maximizing patient outcomes become more and more about maximizing profits. And so how do we prevent that? Well, one thing is that we have the public benefit corporate structure, that you're not supposed to maximize profits. You're supposed to maximize public benefit. How do you enforce that? How do you have an impact committee? What are your metrics? How do you actually enforce that? I think it's going to be primarily determined on who are the investors. If we become a public benefit corp, you can be a public benefit, publicly traded corporation, but it's more challenging, I think, than being a nonprofit owned public benefit corporation. And so we're looking for Australians that have, $80 million or so, or anywhere else. Maybe there's somebody that wasn't there an Australian that just had to pay like $780 million for something? Rupert Murdoch for the
the Fox.
Yeah, 780 million. So if he could just add 80 million, we wouldn't need to go public.
Yeah. All right. Look, I'm conscious that
that was like yeah.
We probably. Sorry, Rick.
No, I do want to say that there was this sense that that I just want to leave, that there's so many different ways that these substances can be used, and that we should not have kind of this idea of there's just one way. So really, just from a regulatory point of view, we think that, and I think you have this same idea for the training program, is that we want to train a certain set of skills, these core competencies, and then post-approval, people should be able to do however they want, whatever they think is
absolutely.
That's I think the main thing I just wanted to add.
Well, I'm delighted you said that, because we think exactly the same, that with the course, what it's designed to do is give people a really good understanding of both the theory and the practice. But then, with our clinicians, there's got to be an ability of clinicians to actually tailor it to the particular patient within the right constraints, the right controls. And out of that comes, well, firstly, innovation, good innovation. But secondly, we find out what really works the best with particular groups of people. And we just need to keep focused on innovation rather than thinking that once this happens, it's a stagnant type of therapy which doesn't change based upon experience. And I think we'll see.
Yeah. And also, though, that there may be different ways and different things better for different patients. And
exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, if I could close by perhaps, well, firstly, thanking you, Rick, and for the work you and your organization have done over a long period of time. We're very excited about the future and the potential or the prospect of registration with the FDA. Hopefully next year, Rick.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully, actually, there's the 38th anniversary of MAPS is April 8th, 2024, and that also happens to be a full solar eclipse in the United States. There won't be another one for 20 more years. So, I don't know that we'll have FDA approval by then, but I wish they would speed it up so that it would happen on that day.
All right. Well, I hope everyone on this webinar. I'm sure everyone on the webinar is very excited about this, and the breakthrough after which will be a breakthrough after 50 years. I just wanted to close, if I may, by just saying this, that rescheduling gives us an amazing opportunity in Australia to have put in place the right controls, the right ethical standards, to do it properly and to do it sensibly. We will never satisfy every clinician. You know, the whole nature of the health sector in Australia, and I'm sure it's the same in America, is there's a whole range of different interests, ranging from incredibly conservative to more innovative, people who don't want to see change, people who do want to see change. We will never satisfy everybody. But I think what we do have to do as a group is be on top of the trial data that's coming out and hold our own with the naysayers. Because often what happens is that people express views based upon their credibility when they haven't done the hard work to understand the therapies. And had they done the hard work, they wouldn't express those views. So for all of you on the call, you know, get on top of the data and the trial evidence and be persuasive in really educating people in the sector that this has the potential to be a massive paradigm shift in the future. It has the potential to dramatically change those mental health statistics that I started with. But to do that, we have to do it in a very conscious way. And we have to recognize we can't please everybody all of the time. And we have to make judgment calls all the time about what will be acceptable to the system and what won't be acceptable. And if I may just close in saying, if you are a clinician, you know, please come onto the webinar tomorrow, register for that. You're going to see Ben Sessa in action covering a whole range of different issues. And he's an incredibly entertaining speaker and an incredibly informative speaker. Come on to that and we can answer the clinical types of, or Ben and Ellie Costa will answer the clinical questions. And we'll talk more about the course and what it involves and financial arrangements for those who can't otherwise afford to be part of the course. And together, let's make change happen in Australia. And let's maintain the momentum we've got. And at all times be focusing on that finishing line, which is, for me, patients and their therapists and medical practitioners being able to talk about different options. And if they choose MDMA-assisted therapy, and if it's regarded as appropriate, having access in an affordable way, irrespective of geographic location and irrespective of wealth. So, Rick, any closing comments you'd like to make?
I do hope that as this therapy really takes hold and starts to develop in Australia, that this question of scale that you said, just this, you know, quality and depth of training will, in the long run, permit a greater scale than sort of you know, rushing to get as many therapists out the door as you can. So I think this kind of if you take a longer view, I think that the kind of things, now that you're adding the in-person training, the protocol to give MDMA, you had eventually, or we can help with supervision parts, that's what's needed. That's the way for the long term. And so I think it's going to be hard because there's so many people that are suffering. The need is you want to scale as fast as possible, but we have to be careful, I think, to scale at the speed of quality training.
Yep, we think very similarly, Rick. We've got to move this at a pace, but not so fast that we lose the capacity to make sure it's done properly. Yeah, it's a very delicate balance, that one. All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for all of those who've attended. The recording will be available on our website very shortly. And, you know, Rick, thank you for giving up your time late at night after having just arrived back in America. And again, thank you for the amazing work you've done over such a long period of time. So,
yeah, thank you, Paul, for Peter, and getting all this change happening down in Australia too.
Right. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and don't forget, if you're a clinician, join us tomorrow for what I think will be a fascinating webinar with Dr. Ben Sesser and Dr. Ellie Kotler. So thank you.
Yeah, and I look forward to seeing some of you in Denver.
Yeah, don't forget Denver.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks, Bill.